The night of October 19th, 1942, was an impenetrable wall of tropical darkness. Lieutenant Robert Lynch stood on the bridge of PT-48, squinting at the black horizon. The humid air of the Solomon Islands pressed against him like a heavy, wet blanket. He was 26 years old, a veteran of 14 patrols, yet he had 0 confirmed kills. Ahead of him, 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges were slicing through the Cape Esperance waters. These were the workhorses of the Tokyo Express, moving 60 elite troops toward the front. They carried the ammunition and food that kept the Imperial Japanese Army alive on the island. To the American Navy, these small, shallow vessels were becoming a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Lynch looked down at the 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted to the sides of his wooden boat. Each torpedo was a 2,000-pound mechanical beast, packed with nearly 500 pounds of raw TNT. They were designed to tear the hulls out of massive load battleships and heavy armored cruisers. But tonight, against these tiny wooden and steel barges, they were nothing more than dead weight. The mathematical reality of the engagement was a cruel joke played by the laws of physics. The Mark 8 torpedoes required a minimum depth setting of 10 feet to run properly and hit. The Japanese Daihatsu barges were designed for shallow water, drawing only 5 feet of draft. No matter how perfectly Lynch aimed, his primary weapons would pass harmlessly underneath the targets. By mid-October, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 was reaching a breaking point in morale. They had already lost 6 boats and 17 brave sailors to the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The tactical pattern had become a repetitive suicide mission for the American crews involved. They would detect the barges, attempt a torpedo run, miss entirely, and then be riddled with fire. The twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns on the PT-48 were legendary for their firepower. Capable of spitting out 850 rounds per minute, they could shred a wooden fishing boat in seconds. However, the Japanese had adapted by installing thick steel plate armor along the sides of the barges. The .50 caliber rounds simply sparked off the metal, leaving the Japanese troops inside untouched. The Japanese were running these supply missions down the slot every single night without fail. When American aircraft made destroyer runs too dangerous, the Japanese simply switched to these barges. Slower and smaller, they were harder to detect on radar and immune to the standard PTO weapons. Squadron commanders at Tulagi were desperate for a solution before the island was completely lost. Field improvisation became the only way for the sailors to survive the coming weeks of combat. Some crews began mounting single-shot Army M337mm anti-tank guns onto the bows of their boats. They would remove the wheels, lashing the heavy guns to timber planks with rope and wire. It was a desperate move that gave them a single shot before a slow, dangerous manual reload. Lieutenant John Kennedy on the PT-109 had tried this exact setup only a few months prior. While the anti-tank gun provided a larger shell, it was not a sustainable weapon for sea combat. The crew had to stand exposed on the deck to reload while Japanese machine guns raked the boat. The real problem was the sheer volume of Japanese traffic moving past the Guadalcanal coast. The Japanese were moving 20 to 30 barges per night, a flood of men and steel. A single-shot gun could not disrupt a supply line of that magnitude during a fast-moving naval battle. Meanwhile, Henderson Field sat 3 miles inland, a scarred landscape of coral and broken aircraft. Captured by Marines on August 7th, the airfield had become a graveyard for the Cactus Air Force. Japanese bombing raids by Betty bombers and Zero fighters hit the airfield almost every single day. The runway was lined with the scorched skeletons of aircraft that had crashed or been blown apart. Dozens of Bell P-39 Aracabra fighters sat in pieces, deemed useless by the mechanics on the ground. But inside those twisted fuselages lay the secret weapon that would change the naval war forever. The Aracabra was a strange aircraft design with the engine mounted behind the pilot's seat. The propeller shaft ran directly under the cockpit, leaving a massive empty space in the nose. This unusual engineering choice allowed for the installation of something truly remarkable and deadly. An Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon was mounted to fire directly through the center of the propeller hub. The M4 cannon was a masterpiece of mid-century engineering, designed to destroy light armor. It could fire 150 rounds per minute, fed by a massive horseshoe-shaped magazine of 30 rounds. With a muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, it fired high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. Lynch looked at the wrecks and realized this cannon was exactly what the Japanese barges feared. Most of the P-39 wrecks at Henderson Field were considered total losses by the Air Force staff. Their wings were sheared off, their engines were seized, and their cockpits were shattered by fire. Yet the cannons nestled in the nose sections were often found to be completely intact and functional. The hydraulic recoil systems and feed mechanisms were waiting for someone to put them back to work. On the morning of October 20th, Lynch walked across the coral of Henderson Field at the crack of dawn. He counted 23 wrecked Airacobras, some having sat in the tropical sun for several weeks. Mechanics had stripped them of instruments and radios, but the massive cannons remained untouched. There was no doctrine for installing a flight weapon on a boat, and certainly no official approval. Lynch stood next to a P-39 that had its nose buried deep in the white Pacific coral. The 37mm barrel protruded from the wreckage like a steel finger pointing toward the sea. He visualized the rate of fire 150 rounds per minute and the carnage it would cause on a barge. 3 of his best mechanics stood behind him, watching their officers' eyes as he did the mental math. At 14 o'clock hours that afternoon, Lynch approached Commander Alan Calvert with a radical, untested idea. There were no official forms for this request and no procurement system to provide the hardware. He simply asked for permission to scavenge the airfield and build something that shouldn't exist. Calvert, seeing the desperation in the squadron's eyes, gave the order to proceed with the experiment. By 1630, 4 PT boat crews were scouring Henderson Field with cutting torches and heavy wrenches. They knew they only had until nightfall to find the parts before the next Japanese bombing raid. The Oldsmobile M4 cannon was a heavy beast, weighing 213 pounds without its ammunition magazine. The hydraulic recoil system and feed mechanism added another 70 pounds to the total weight. A complete gun assembly from a P-39 weighed approximately 280 pounds, a massive load for a deck. Lynch's PT-48 was an Elco 80-foot boat, built from 2 layers of 1-inch mahogany planks. The deck was 3/4-inch plywood supported by oak frames spaced every 2 feet. No Navy engineer had ever calculated if this wooden frame could withstand an automatic cannon's recoil. Technical Sergeant James Coogan was the man they needed to make the impossible work that day. He had maintained Erica Bruce in Michigan before the war and knew every bolt and hydraulic line. Signed to Henderson as an armorer, he was the first man Lynch's crew found in the wreckage. Coogan agreed to help, crawling into the nose of a shattered plane with a wrench set in hand. The first plane they approached had been hit by a 20mm shell that had killed the pilot instantly. The wreck had been left to rot in the sun, a grim reminder of the air war overhead. Coogan worked with a 3/4-inch socket, the closest match he had for the high-tensile steel bolts. He had to disconnect the hydraulic lines and the charging cable while the tropical heat rose. The removal of each cannon required cutting through the engine mounts and firing solenoid wiring. It was back-breaking work that took nearly 2 hours for every aircraft they successfully stripped. Lynch detailed 8 men to the task, divided into 2-man teams to maximize their dwindling time. They hoped to have 4 cannons by nightfall, but the jungle and the heat had other plans. The second P-39 wreck had been baking in the sun for 11 days, making the metal scalding hot. The hydraulic fluid inside the recoil system had congealed into a thick, sticky mess. Worse yet, the mounting bolts had seized due to the extreme heat expansion of the tropical climate. Without penetrating oil, the men were forced to use aviation gasoline to loosen the frozen metal. They waited 20 minutes for the gasoline to work its way into the threads of the seized bolts. Slowly, the metal groaned and gave way, allowing the crew to lower the cannon onto the coral. By 1730, they had successfully harvested 3 complete M4 cannon assemblies from the graveyard. They laid them out like surgical trophies on the edge of the runway apron for a final inspection. Coogan went to work inspecting the mechanisms, searching for any signs of cracks or fatal wear. The first cannon was immediately rejected because its hydraulic recoil cylinder was hairline cracked. The second had a bent feed pawl, but Coogan knew he could fix it with a file in 30 minutes. The third cannon was pristine, appearing as if it had just rolled off the factory floor in Detroit. The next challenge was the most difficult. They had no way to mount these guns to the boats. The bow deck of a PT boat was a flat surface, not designed for the violent recoil of a 37mm gun. Lynch needed a pedestal mount that could rotate 360 degrees and absorb the shock of firing. It also had to survive the violent flexing of a hull hitting the waves at 40 knots. The Henderson Field Machine Shop was a primitive shack with only a lathe and a drill press. A diesel generator provided the power, but it was constantly failing due to fuel rationing. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey was the man who had turned scrap into a naval weapon. He used a grease pencil to sketch a pedestal design onto a sheet of salvaged aircraft aluminum. The design used a 12-inch steel base plate with 4 bolt holes to match the boat's frame. A vertical pipe section was welded to the center, topped with a rotating collar and a gun yoke. The material was all salvaged scrap, primarily taken from the landing gear of destroyed planes. Frey's team began the welding process at 1815, working in the flickering light of the shop. The welding had to be done in 5-minute intervals to prevent the overheating generator from dying. The base plate was finished first, followed by the pipe section and the complex rotating collar. The bearing surfaces had to be machined smooth by hand to ensure the gun wouldn't bind in combat. By 21 o'clock, they had produced a crude, scorched pedestal that looked like a high school project. It was ugly, the welds were thick, and the rotating collar had a slight 3-degree wobble, but it was heavy, it was solid, and it was capable of holding a 280-pound automatic cannon. They loaded the equipment onto a 6x6 truck and raced toward the docks at Lunga Point. 3 sailors sat in the back, physically holding the cannon steady over the bumpy dirt roads. A Higgins boat ferried the heavy gear across the water to where PT-48 was waiting at Tulagi. Lynch's crew had already marked the deck, choosing the strongest oak frames for the mounting point. They began the arduous process of drilling for holes through the plywood and the thick oak below. Using a hand-crank drill, it took the exhausted men 30 minutes to finish each individual hole. By 1:15 on the morning of October 21st, the base plate was finally bolted down and secured. The crew used a block and tackle to lift the 37mm cannon and seat it into the makeshift yoke. To their relief, the collar fit and the gun could elevate and depress through its full range. It rotated with a grinding sound, but it moved, giving the gunner a wide field of fire. Ammunition was the final hurdle, as the PT boat had no storage bay for the massive magazines. The horseshoe-shaped magazines held 30 rounds and weighed 40 pounds when fully loaded. Lynch's solution was simple. They would stack 6 magazines on the open deck near the gun. The loader would have to stand in the spray and hand-feed the gun while the boat was at speed. At 2 o'clock, PT-48 became the first boat in the U.S. Navy to carry an automatic aircraft cannon. It had taken only 9 hours to go from a crashed plane to a functional naval weapon system. There was no time for a test fire or a stress test of the wooden deck and the steel mount. Japanese supply barges were reported moving that very night, and Lynch had to intercept them. PT-48 departed the Tulagi docks at 22 o'clock, leading a formation of 4 boats into the dark. They ran on 2 engines at 15 knots to keep their wake small and their noise levels low. Gunner's mate Harold Mitchell volunteered to man the bow gun, sitting on a stack of ammo boxes. He had no training on the M4, only a few verbal instructions whispered to him at the dock. The night was overcast, and the visibility was less than 200 yards in the starlight. The sea was eerily calm as the PT-48's radar operator searched the green glow of his screen. At 23:55, the operator called out a contact for surface targets moving at 8 knots. Lynch felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the Tokyo Express was right on schedule. Traditional PT boat doctrine required closing to within 1,000 yards to fire torpedoes. But Lynch knew his torpedoes were useless, and he needed to get even closer for the cannon. At 3,000 yards, the silhouettes of the Daihatsu barges became visible against the black water. Each barge was nearly 50 feet long, armored with steel, and packed with Japanese infantry. Lynch watched the shapes of the men on the barges, unaware of the monster coming toward them. At 1,500 yards, Mitchell grabbed the manual charging handle and chambered the first 37mm shell. He flipped the safety off and gripped the trigger, his heart pounding against his ribs. The crew of the PT-48 held their breath, wondering if the first shot would rip the deck apart. At 1,000 yards, the lead Japanese barge spotted the PT boat and opened fire with a machine gun. The orange tracers of the Type 92 gun stitched the water, splashing just short of the bow. Lynch didn't flinch, maintaining his course as he closed the gap to 800 yards. Then he gave the order that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War: open fire. The 37mm cannon roared, and a massive muzzle flash turned the PT-48's bow into a wall of white light. The recoil was violent, driving the gun back and causing the wooden deck to groan and flex. But the pedestal held, and the shells streaked across the water at 2,000 feet per second. Mitchell kept his finger buried in the trigger as the automatic cannon cycled with a rhythmic thunder. In 12 seconds, the 30-round magazine was empty, and the lead barge was a vision of hell. The high-explosive rounds didn't just hit the barge. They punched through the armor and detonated inside. The barge's diesel fuel tank ignited, sending a pillar of orange flame high into the night sky. Japanese troops were thrown into the water as their vessel began to settle and sink by the bow. Mitchell yanked the empty magazine off and slammed a fresh one onto the feed mechanism. The reload took 8 seconds, an eternity in the middle of a frantic close-range naval battle. The second barge tried to turn hard to port, but the PT-48 was too fast and too agile. Lynch closed to 600 yards and Mitchell let loose with another 30 rounds of fire. 22 rounds from the second magazine struck the second barge with devastating accuracy. The first few rounds hammered the armor, and then the 7th round found the ammunition stash. The barge didn't just burn. It exploded in a massive fireball that was visible for 10 miles. The remaining 2 barges scattered in terror, turning toward the safety of the dark coastline. PT-48 pursued the southern barge, with Mitchell muscling the gun to keep it on the target. The rotating collar was already beginning to bind from the extreme heat of the rapid fire. The bearing surfaces were scoring under the stress, but Mitchell refused to stop his attack. He fired his third magazine, walking the explosive shells from the barge's stern to its bow. The third barge's engine died as the 37mm rounds shredded the machinery and the hull. The vessel drifted aimlessly, no longer a threat to the island or a source of supply. Lynch broke off the attack at 0:20, having fired 90 rounds in a few minutes of chaos. He had destroyed 2 barges and disabled a third without a single American casualty. Lynch radioed Tulagi with a brief, historic message: the salvaged aircraft cannon worked. The success was so absolute that by 3 o'clock every boat commander was demanding his own gun. However, the reality of the salvage operation was that the supply of wrecks was very limited. The squadron had 12 boats, but there were only a handful of usable cannons left on the field. By October 23rd, 3 more boats had been outfitted with the Lynch Special on their bows. The salvage process was becoming more systematic as the mechanics learned the shortcuts. The time required to remove a cannon dropped from 2 hours down to only 55 minutes. Teams knew exactly which bolts to cut and which wires to ignore to get the gun free. Chief Frey refined the pedestal design, incorporating bronze bushings to handle the friction. These bushings were salvaged from aircraft wheel assemblies to ensure a smooth 360-degree turn. The Generation 2 mounts were far superior to the crude prototype used on the PT-48. They could withstand the vibration of the boat and the heat of the gun without seizing up. Ammunition supply remained the most critical bottleneck for the entire squadron's operations. Each engagement consumed several magazines, and the armory was struggling to keep up. 4 loaders worked 12-hour shifts, hand-seating every shell into the horseshoe magazines. They could only produce 40 magazines a day, barely enough for 2 patrols per boat. The high-explosive rounds were proving to be the perfect weapon against the Japanese armor. While designed to destroy aluminum planes, they tore through quarter-inch steel with ease. A single hit created a 12-inch hole, spraying deadly shrapnel through the barge's interior. The psychological impact on the Japanese crews was immediate and absolutely terrifying. Japanese radio intercepts began to mention demon boats armed with aircraft cannons. The crews of the Tokyo Express, once confident in their armor, were now being slaughtered. By November 1st, 8 PT boats in the squadron were operating with these salvaged guns. The tactical landscape of the Solomon Islands had shifted in favor of the American sailors. The M4 cannon required constant maintenance that the PT boats weren't designed to provide. Saltwater corrosion and tropical heat were the twin enemies of the hydraulic recoil systems. Gunners' mates had to learn to field strip the weapons using improvised tools and cleaning kits. Technical Sergeant Coogan was eventually transferred to Tulagi to oversee the maintenance shop. Coogan set up a workshop in a small metal shed, training sailors on the nuances of the M4. The training took 3 days per man, ensuring each boat had an expert on the weapon system. The success of these field modifications eventually reached the high command in the Pacific. Reports showed that the cannons had increased the kill rate of the squadron by a massive margin. In November, a dispatch was sent to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C. It detailed the salvage operation, the combat results, and the design of the pedestal mount. The Navy requested official approval and the procurement of factory-made cannons for the fleet. Normally, this bureaucratic process would take years to reach a final production decision. But the combat data from Guadalcanal was too compelling for the officials to ignore or delay. On December 7, 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance authorized the mass production of the mounts. A contractor in Rhode Island was given the order to build 100 units as fast as possible. Still, the sailors in the Pacific couldn't wait 3 months for a shipment from the States. Squadron 6 arrived at Tulagi in mid-December, but they came with standard ineffective weapons. They were shocked to see Squadron 3 destroying barges with aircraft guns and scrap steel. The supply of salvaged guns at Henderson Field had been completely exhausted by then. However, a shipment of fresh P-39 replacement parts arrived at a depot in New Caledonia. The shipment included 12 factory-fresh M4 cannons intended for the 13th Air Force. PT boat commanders used creative requisitioning to divert the guns to the Tulagi docks. By December 20th, the new cannons were being installed on the boats of Squadron 6. These pristine guns operated much more smoothly than the salvaged wrecks from the airfield. By January 1943, 24 PT boats in the Solomons were equipped with 37mm cannons. The Japanese supply lines were facing systematic destruction at the hands of these gunboats. Stats showed 41 barges destroyed and 19 damaged in a single month of cannon operations. The 37mm gun gave the PT boats an offensive reach they never had with torpedoes alone. More importantly, the American casualty rate plummeted after the cannons were installed. The guns allowed the boats to engage the enemy from ranges where machine guns were weak. PT boat losses decreased by 60% compared to the early months of the Guadalcanal campaign. The sailors were finally winning the war of attrition in the shallow coastal waters. Tactical doctrine evolved to include hunter-killer pairs of boats working in tandem. One boat would suppress the barge with .50 caliber fire, while the other used the cannon. This maximized the fire density and ensured the barge couldn't return effective fire. Japanese destroyers began escorting the barges, but the 37mm gave the PT boats a fighting chance. The Bureau of Ordnance eventually developed an improved cannon specifically for the Navy. The M9 cannon had a longer barrel and a much higher muzzle velocity than the original M4. It entered production in August 1943, manufactured by the legendary Colt Firearms Company, weighing 405 pounds. It was a much more robust and powerful weapon for sea duty. The first M9 cannons reached the Pacific in October 1943, requiring reinforced deck structures. Naval architects had to design steel plate backing to prevent the deck from cracking under fire. The M9 extended the effective range to 1,000 yards, a significant upgrade over the M4. This extra distance kept the American crews even safer from the Japanese return fire. By January 1944, the 37mm cannon had become standard factory equipment for all new boats. Higgins and Elco Industries were installing the guns on the assembly lines in the States. What began as a desperate act of salvage was now the official doctrine of the U.S. Navy, the transition. From scrap metal to standard armament had taken only 18 months. The Mediterranean theater also saw the benefits of this radical field innovation in 1944. Narrower seas and heavy coastal defenses made the cannon's high rate of fire essential. American PT boats engaged German convoys and F-lighters off the rugged Italian coast. The explosive 37mm shells were just as effective against German steel as Japanese wood. One engagement off Anzio demonstrated the sheer power of the M9 naval cannon. PT-208 destroyed 2 German lighters and damaged a third in only 15 minutes. They only expended 120 rounds to achieve a victory that torpedoes would have missed. The weapon had proved its worth in every theater of the global war. When the Navy returned to the Philippines in late 1944, the PT boats were fully armed. They operated in Leyte Gulf, providing support for the massive Allied invasion force. Japanese forces used anything that could float to move troops and supplies to the front. PT boats with 37mm cannons systematically erased this traffic from the surface of the sea. In November 1944, 36 PT boats engaged 87 Japanese vessels in the Philippine waters. They destroyed 63 of them, a staggering success rate for such small naval craft. The boats had transformed from torpedo platforms into heavily armed fast gunboats. The legacy of the first salvaged gun on PT-48 was now visible in every engagement. Colt manufactured over 1,500 M9 cannons before the end of the war in 1945. They were used on landing craft, patrol boats, and even coastal defense installations. But the PT boats always received the highest priority for these devastating weapons. By the final months of the war, Japanese barge traffic had essentially ceased to exist. The final major PT boat operation of the war took place in Borneo in June 1945. Australian and American forces relied on the boats for fire support and anti-barge patrols. The 37mm cannons were ready, though the Japanese resistance was beginning to crumble. Desperate improvisation had officially become the standard for modern naval warfare. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and the long, bloody conflict finally ended. Of the 531 PT boats that served, nearly all of the survivors carried a 37mm cannon. Post-war analysis proved that cannon-equipped boats were 6 times more effective. The numbers were definitive. The 37mm cannon was the most important upgrade of the war. The total number of Japanese vessels destroyed by these cannons exceeded 800 confirmed kills. This translated to roughly 48,000 Japanese troops who never reached their intended targets. Over 6,000 tons of supplies were sent to the bottom of the ocean by the 37mm shells. Vice Admiral Mikawa later admitted that PT boat attacks had crippled their defensive plans. Lieutenant Robert Lynch survived the war, having commanded the PT 48 through 47 patrols. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his role in pioneering the cannon modification. He returned to a quiet civilian life in Philadelphia, rarely speaking of his achievements. Lynch passed away in 1978, leaving behind a legacy of ingenuity and courage. Technical Sergeant James Coogan remained in the military, retiring as a master sergeant. He kept detailed logs of every gun he salvaged and every modification he made at Tulagi. Those logs are now preserved in the National Archives as a record of field engineering. Coogan's dedication ensured that the Demon boats remained operational throughout the war. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey returned to Tacoma, Washington, after his service. He worked in a shipyard, the same kind of hands-on work he did at Henderson Field, though he received no medals for his pedestal design. It was used on hundreds of boats. Frey died in 1991, one of the many unsung heroes who built the road to victory. Gunner's mate Harold Mitchell, who fired that first historic shot, lived until 2006. He spent part of the war as a gunnery instructor, teaching others the art of the 37 millimeters. He even served on the PT-109, sharing his expertise with future leaders of the country. Mitchell's bravery on the bow of the PT-48 proved that the concept was a winner. Today, only 12 PT boats remain in existence, scattered across various naval museums. Most of these survivors still feature the 37 millimeters cannon mounts on their mahogany decks. The PT-617 in Massachusetts displays a functional M9 cannon for all visitors to see. It stands as a silent monument to the men who refused to let a lack of weapons stop them. The development of the 37 millimeters boat gun was a complete reversal of the standard process. Usually requirements are written and prototypes are tested for years before deployment. The PT boat crews skipped every step, testing their prototypes in the heat of actual combat. The Navy only authorized production after the sailors had already proven the gun worked. This timeline, 18 months from combat use to factory standard, was remarkably fast. Yet for the sailors dying in the Solomon Islands, it felt like an eternity to wait. They bridged that gap with their own hands, their own tools, and their own bravery. They didn't wait for permission to win, simply found a way to make it happen. Military organizations often resist field modifications due to safety and logistical concerns. Commander Calvert took a massive professional risk by authorizing Lynch's experiment. Had the deck failed or the gun exploded, Calvert would have faced a harsh court-martial. He chose the lives of his men over the safety of his career, and the gamble paid off. The Bureau of Ordnance also deserves credit for listening to the men on the front lines. They could have shut down the modification as non-standard or unauthorized equipment. Instead, they looked at the data. 14 barges destroyed, and 0 PT boats lost. They recognized the genius of the field crews and moved to support them immediately. This flexibility was a hallmark of the American Navy during the Pacific Campaign. While the Army often rejected field-modified armor, the Navy embraced successful hacks. The 37 millimeters cannon became the most successful field modification of the entire Second World War. It fundamentally changed how small unit naval combat was fought in the Pacific theater. The lesson of the 37 millimeters cannon transcends the specific details of the weapon itself. It is a story about the power of documentation, command support, and raw ingenuity. Lynch documented his kills. Calvert supported the risk, and the Bureau evaluated the data. When the system works with the soldiers, the results can change the course of history. Modern military units still follow these patterns of rapid adaptation in the field today. From special operations to drone warfare, the Henderson field spirit is still alive. It requires a commander willing to take a risk and a crew willing to experiment with scrap. The 800 destroyed vessels stand as proof that a practical solution is better than a perfect one. PT boats earned their legendary reputation through innovations like the aircraft cannon. They were simple wooden boats, yet they were feared by the most powerful navy in the East. What made them effective was the spirit of the men who manned the mahogany decks. They took salvaged parts and made them work, outthinking an enemy that outgunned them. Japanese sailors will always remember the green dragons that came for them in the night. The names they gave the PT boats reflected a deep respect earned through blood and fire. The 37mm cannon gave these small boats the teeth they needed to bite back at the Empire. It was the perfect marriage of aerial firepower and naval mobility in a time of crisis. The story of these sailors is a reminder that the best weapons aren't always built in factories. Sometimes they are found in the dirt, covered in grease and pulled from the wreckage of defeat. The men of Squadron 3 didn't see junk at Henderson Field. They saw the keys to survival. They turned a graveyard into an arsenal and a failure into a legendary victory. Every time you see a PT boat in a movie or a museum, look at the gun on the bow. Remember that it wasn't supposed to be there, and no one gave them the parts to build it. It represents the thousands of Japanese troops who were stopped by a few determined sailors. It represents the 18 months of struggle to turn a hack into a standard weapon. If you've stuck with us through this incredible journey, we want to hear from you. The story of the 37mm cannon is one of the greatest tales of the Pacific War. Hit that like button to help us share the story of Lynch, Mitchell, and Coogan with others. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the Naval Archives. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments if you have family who served. We are a global community dedicated to keeping these heroic memories alive for the next generation. Your engagement helps ensure that these demon boat stories never fade into the silence of history. Thank you for being a part of this mission and for honoring the ingenuity of the greatest generation. The final shells have been fired, and the mahogany boats have long since left the water. But the spirit of the sailors who welded aircraft guns to wooden decks will live on forever. They proved that with a little scrap metal and a lot of heart, anything is possible in war. Until next time, keep the history alive, and remember the power of the 37mm cannon.